Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in the sterile hallway of St. Mary's Medical Center, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of her last surgery. She had just saved the life of a construction worker who had fallen 3 stories, his internal injuries so severe that 2 other surgeons had already declared the case hopeless. But Sarah never gave up on anyone. Her military training had taught her that every life was worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she made her way toward the administrative wing. She had been summoned by the new hospital director, Dr. Richard Blackwood, who had taken over just 6 months ago. Sarah had heard whispers throughout the hospital about Blackwood's cost-cutting measures and his obsession with following protocol to the letter. She wondered what this meeting could be about, especially so late in the evening. Sarah's career at St. Mary's had been nothing short of extraordinary. For 8 years, she had served as the head of trauma surgery, building one of the most respected emergency departments on the East Coast. Her background as a Navy combat surgeon had given her skills that few civilian doctors possessed. She could perform complex procedures under pressure that would make other surgeons break into a cold sweat. Her success rate was legendary, and patients often requested her specifically when facing life-threatening situations. The hallway seemed longer than usual as she walked toward Blackwood's office. Sarah reflected on her journey to this moment. After serving 2 tours in Afghanistan, she had struggled to readjust to civilian medicine. The pace seemed too slow, the bureaucracy too thick, and the resources too abundant compared to the field hospitals where she had learned to work miracles with almost nothing. But St. Mary's had given her a purpose again. Here she could use her unique skills to save lives without the constant threat of enemy fire. She knocked on the heavy oak door of the director's office. Blackwood's voice called for her to enter. The office was expensively furnished, a stark contrast to the practical medical equipment that filled the rest of the hospital. Blackwood sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, his suit perfectly pressed despite the late hour. He was a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that seemed to magnify his cold, calculating eyes. "Dr. Mitchell, please sit down," Blackwood said without looking up from the papers spread across his desk. Sarah noticed they were personnel files, and she could see her own photograph clipped to the top of one stack. "Good evening, Dr. Blackwood," Sarah replied, settling into the uncomfortable chair across from him. "I assume this is about the Peterson case? I know my methods were unconventional, but the patient is stable now and expected to make a full recovery." Blackwood finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "This isn't about one case, Dr. Mitchell. This is about a pattern of behavior that I can no longer tolerate in this institution." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had heard this tone before, usually right before someone's career was destroyed. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, sir." "Let me be clear," Blackwood continued, pulling a thick folder from the stack. "In the past 6 months, you have violated hospital protocol 17 times. You have performed procedures without proper authorization, used experimental techniques without ethics committee approval, and consistently disregarded the chain of command when making critical decisions." "Every one of those decisions saved a life," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "The Peterson case tonight is a perfect example. If I had followed standard protocol and waited for multiple consultations, that man would have died on the operating table." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Protocol exists for a reason, Dr. Mitchell. It protects patients, protects the hospital from liability, and ensures that we maintain our accreditation. Your cowboy mentality might have worked in the military, but this is a civilian hospital with civilian standards." Sarah felt anger building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Sir, with respect, my cowboy mentality has resulted in a 97% survival rate in cases where the initial prognosis was death. I understand the importance of protocol, but sometimes medical emergencies require immediate action." "That's exactly the attitude that has brought us to this point," Blackwood said, opening her personnel file. I have reports from nurses who say you're difficult to work with because you expect them to anticipate your every move. Other doctors complain that you make them look incompetent with your unorthodox approaches. And don't even get me started on the supply costs associated with your experimental techniques. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Are you seriously more concerned about supply costs than patient outcomes? I'm concerned about running a hospital efficiently and profitably, Blackwood replied sharply. Something you seem incapable of understanding. This institution cannot continue to operate at a loss while one surgeon plays God with every case that comes through the doors. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Playing God? She had dedicated her entire adult life to saving others, first in the military and then in civilian practice. Every decision she made was calculated to give patients the best possible chance of survival. The fact that her methods sometimes fell outside conventional wisdom didn't diminish their effectiveness. Dr. Blackwood, she said carefully, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My methods may be unconventional, but my results speak for themselves. I'm willing to work with you to find ways to better integrate my approach with hospital protocol. Blackwood shook his head. It's too late for compromises, Dr. Mitchell. I've made my decision. He pulled a prepared document from the folder and slid it across the desk. Your employment at St. Mary's Medical Center is terminated, effective immediately. Sarah felt the words hit her like a physical force. She picked up the termination letter with hands that suddenly felt numb. The official language blurred together as she tried to process what was happening. After 8 years of dedicated service, after saving hundreds of lives, she was being fired for caring too much. This is a mistake, she whispered, more to herself than to Blackwood. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, Blackwood continued as if she hadn't spoken. Your access credentials have already been deactivated. I expect a smooth transition with minimal disruption to hospital operations. Sarah stood slowly, the termination letter still clutched in her hand. She wanted to argue, to fight back, to make Blackwood understand what he was throwing away. But she had learned in the military that some battles couldn't be won with words. Sometimes the only victory came in how gracefully you accepted defeat. I hope you never find yourself in a situation where conventional medicine isn't enough, she said quietly as she turned toward the door. Because when that day comes, you'll remember this conversation very differently. Blackwood didn't respond as Sarah walked out of his office for the last time. The hallway seemed even longer on her way back, and she could hear the familiar sounds of the hospital around her, monitors beeping, pages being called overhead, the quiet conversations of night shift staff caring for patients. This had been her world for 8 years, and now she was a stranger in it. As she reached the main corridor, Sarah saw Dr. Jennifer Walsh, one of the younger trauma surgeons who had learned much of her technique from Sarah's guidance. Jennifer looked surprised to see her mentor walking through the halls so late. Sarah, what are you doing here? I thought you'd gone home hours ago. Sarah managed a weak smile. Just finishing up some administrative business. Take care of yourself. Jen, and remember what I taught you about thinking outside the box. Sometimes the textbook answer isn't the right answer. Jennifer looked confused by the cryptic advice, but before she could ask for clarification, Sarah had already continued down the hallway toward the exit. As the automatic doors slid shut behind her, Sarah realized that her life had just changed forever. She had no idea that within 24 hours, St. Mary's Medical Center would face its greatest crisis ever, and Dr. Richard Blackwood would desperately wish he could undo the decision he had just made. 22 hours after Dr. Sarah Mitchell walked out of St. Mary's Medical Center for the last time, the morning shift was just beginning their routine when the first emergency call came in. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was reviewing patient charts when her pager erupted in a series of urgent beeps. The emergency dispatcher's voice crackled through the hospital's communication system with news that would change everything. Multiple vehicle collision on Interstate 95. School bus involved. Estimated 45 casualties incoming. ETA 15 minutes. The words sent shockwaves through the emergency department. School bus accidents were every hospital's nightmare scenario. Multiple pediatric trauma cases arriving simultaneously, each requiring immediate attention from specialized teams. Jennifer felt her heart rate spike as she began coordinating the emergency response protocol that Sarah had developed and refined over the years. Dr. Richard Blackwood received the alert in his office and immediately made his way to the emergency department. He had been feeling confident about his decision to terminate Dr. Mitchell, especially after a peaceful night shift with no major incidents. But as he watched the organized chaos unfolding in preparation for the incoming casualties, he began to realize the magnitude of what was about to happen. The first ambulance arrived exactly 14 minutes after the initial call. Paramedics rushed through the automatic doors wheeling a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, whose left arm was clearly fractured and who was showing signs of internal bleeding. Behind her came a teenage boy with severe head trauma, his vital signs fluctuating dangerously. Then another child and another, until the emergency department was overwhelmed with broken young bodies requiring immediate surgical intervention. Jennifer found herself triaging patients with a speed and precision that surprised even her. Sarah's training had prepared her for mass casualty events, but the reality was far more intense than any simulation. She quickly identified the most critical cases and began directing them toward the available operating theaters. But within an hour, it became clear that they were facing a crisis beyond their current capabilities. The hospital had 6 operating rooms, but only 3 trauma surgeons on duty. Dr. Mitchell had typically handled the most complex cases herself, allowing the other surgeons to manage more straightforward procedures. Without her expertise, cases that should have been routine were taking longer. Complications were arising that the remaining staff wasn't fully equipped to handle, and the backup list was growing dangerously long. Dr. Marcus Webb, the senior surgeon after Sarah's departure, was struggling with a particularly difficult case when he called for Dr. Blackwood to join him in operating room 2. The patient was a 14-year-old boy with massive internal trauma that required surgical techniques Dr. Webb had only read about in medical journals. These were the types of procedures that Dr. Mitchell had pioneered during her military service and perfected in civilian practice. "I need to be honest with you, Richard," Dr. Webb said, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool operating room temperature. "This kid needs a level of surgical intervention that I'm not comfortable attempting. The internal damage is unlike anything I've seen in civilian practice. If we had Sarah here..." Blackwood watched through the observation window as monitors showed the young patient's vital signs becoming increasingly unstable. For the first time since making his decision the previous evening, he began to question whether he had acted too hastily, but pride prevented him from admitting the mistake out loud. "Do your best, Marcus," was all he could manage to say. Meanwhile, in the emergency department, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. More ambulances continued arriving as additional victims were extracted from the massive pileup that had followed the initial school bus accident. What had started as a single incident had cascaded into a multi-vehicle collision involving 17 cars and trucks, turning a difficult situation into an absolute catastrophe. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was running between patients when she received word that 2 of the most critical cases had been declared beyond their current capabilities. The phrase was hospital code for patients who needed surgical expertise that wasn't available on site. Normally, such patients would be transferred to larger trauma centers, but those facilities were also overwhelmed by victims from the same accident. As the afternoon wore on, the harsh reality became impossible to ignore. The hospital was failing its patients at the moment they needed help most desperately. 3 children had already been lost to complications that Dr. Mitchell would likely have prevented. Several others remained in critical condition, requiring procedures that the current surgical team simply couldn't perform with confidence. The breaking point came when a 7-year-old girl was brought in with injuries so severe that every surgeon on duty examined her case and reached the same conclusion. She needed surgical intervention that was beyond their expertise. Her condition was similar to cases Dr. Mitchell had handled successfully many times before. Complex trauma requiring innovative techniques and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. Dr. Blackwood stood in his office, watching the chaos unfold through his window overlooking the emergency department parking lot. Ambulances continued arriving in steady streams, their lights painting the building in alternating red and blue. News vans had begun gathering outside as word of the massive accident spread through the community. The hospital's reputation, which he had been so concerned about protecting, was about to be destroyed by his own decisions. His assistant knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. "Sir, we have a problem. The medical board is demanding an immediate review of our emergency response capabilities. 3 families have already contacted lawyers about the delays in treatment, and the mayor's office is asking why our trauma department seems unprepared for this type of incident." Blackwood sank into his chair, finally understanding the full weight of his mistake. Dr. Mitchell hadn't just been a trauma surgeon. She had been the foundation upon which the entire emergency department's reputation was built. Her unconventional methods hadn't been reckless experimentation. They had been innovative solutions to impossible problems. The phone on his desk rang, and his assistant informed him that Dr. Webb needed to speak with him urgently. When he picked up the line, Marcus's voice was strained and exhausted. "Richard, I need you to listen carefully. We have a situation that requires immediate action. The 7-year-old girl who came in an hour ago, she's going to die unless we can get someone here who has experience with combat-level trauma surgery. The techniques needed to save her are beyond anything we learned in civilian medical school." "What are you suggesting, Marcus?" "I'm suggesting that you need to contact Dr. Mitchell immediately. Put aside whatever personal issues led to her termination and get her back here. This child's life depends on it, and she might not be the last one." For the first time since becoming hospital director, Blackwood felt completely out of his depth. The protocols and cost-benefit analyses that governed his decision-making offered no guidance for this situation. He had fired the one person who could navigate the crisis they now faced, and his pride was preventing him from doing what needed to be done. But as he looked out at the continuing stream of ambulances and thought about the young patients whose lives hung in the balance, Richard Blackwood finally understood that sometimes being a leader meant admitting when you had made a catastrophic mistake. The question was whether Dr. Sarah Mitchell would be willing to help the hospital that had just cast her aside, and whether she could get there in time to make a difference for the patients who desperately needed her skills. As another critical patient was rushed through the emergency entrance, Blackwood realized he was about to find out if his pride was worth more than the lives of the people his hospital was supposed to protect. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Blackwood reached for his phone, knowing that the next call he made would determine not just the fate of his patients, but the future of his own career and the reputation of St. Mary's Medical Center. Dr. Richard Blackwood's hands trembled slightly as he dialed Dr. Sarah Mitchell's personal cell phone number. He had practiced what he would say during the elevator ride to his office, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed inadequate. After 3 rings, Sarah's familiar voice answered, though it sounded distant and tired. "Dr. Mitchell speaking. Sarah, this is Richard Blackwood." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. "I know our last conversation didn't end well, but I need your help. We have a mass casualty situation here, and frankly, we're in over our heads." Another pause. Then Sarah's voice, professional but cold. "How many casualties?" 57 confirmed so far from a multi-vehicle accident involving a school bus. We've lost 3 patients already, and we have several more who need surgical intervention beyond our current capabilities." Blackwood swallowed his pride completely. We need you back here, Sarah. These kids need you. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The coldness replaced by the focused intensity that Blackwood remembered from her surgical consultations. What's the status of your most critical patients? For the next 10 minutes, Blackwood provided details about each case while Sarah asked specific medical questions. He could hear her moving around on the other end of the call, and he realized she was already preparing to help, despite how badly he had treated her. "Richard," she finally said, "I'm currently at Naval Station Norfolk consulting on a training exercise. I can be at St. Mary's within 45 minutes, but I'll need several things prepared before I arrive. First, clear operating room 1 and have it set up for pediatric trauma surgery. Second, I need Dr. Walsh to review the emergency protocols we developed for mass casualty events. Third, and this is non-negotiable, I need complete authority over treatment decisions without interference from administration." Blackwood didn't hesitate. "Done. All of it. How are you getting here so quickly from Norfolk?" "Navy helicopter. They're providing transport for medical emergency support. We'll be landing on the hospital roof in approximately 40 minutes. As Blackwood hung up the phone, he felt a combination of relief and deep shame. Sarah hadn't asked about her termination, hadn't demanded an apology, hadn't even mentioned the harsh words they had exchanged. Her only concern was getting to the patients who needed her help. Word spread quickly through the hospital that Dr. Mitchell was returning. The effect on staff morale was immediate and dramatic. Nurses who had been struggling to keep up with the overwhelming caseload suddenly moved with renewed purpose. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had been coordinating the emergency response with growing desperation, felt tears of relief when she received the news. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching the hospital created a stir among the gathered news crews and anxious families in the parking lot. Few civilian hospitals regularly received helicopter traffic on their rooftops, and the sight of a military aircraft descending toward St. Mary's Medical Center created a buzz of excitement and speculation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the Navy helicopter, wearing surgical scrubs under a military flight jacket, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. She had changed clothes during the flight and received detailed updates about each critical patient through encrypted military communication channels. Her mind was already focused on the surgical challenges waiting for her inside the building. She moved through the hospital corridors with the purposeful stride that staff remembered well. Nurses and doctors who hadn't seen her since the previous evening looked surprised and relieved as she passed. Sarah's presence seemed to bring an immediate sense of calm and competence to the chaotic environment. Her first stop was Operating Room 1, where the 7-year-old girl with severe internal trauma was being prepped for surgery. Dr. Webb met her at the scrub station, his relief obvious as he briefed her on the case. Multiple organ damage, severe internal bleeding, and what appears to be a rare arterial tear that I've never seen outside of medical textbooks, he explained while they scrubbed in together. Sarah nodded, her mind already calculating the surgical approach. I've seen this injury pattern before in combat zones. It requires a modified vascular repair technique combined with emergency organ stabilization. The key is working fast enough to prevent systemic shock, while being precise enough not to cause additional damage. As they entered the operating room, Sarah's transformation was remarkable to watch. The woman who had been fired less than 24 hours earlier for being too unconventional became a focused, precise surgical instrument. Her hands moved with confidence and speed that amazed even the experienced operating room staff. The surgery required techniques that Dr. Webb had never seen performed live. Sarah's military experience became evident as she adapted battlefield surgical methods to civilian equipment, creating innovative solutions in real time. She talked the surgical team through each step, turning the operation into an impromptu teaching session that would benefit future cases. 3 hours later, the 7-year-old girl was stable and expected to make a full recovery, But Sarah's work was far from finished. Two other critical patients required immediate attention, each presenting surgical challenges that had been beyond the comfort level of the available staff. As she moved between operating rooms, Sarah also coordinated with Dr. Walsh to manage the overall emergency response more effectively. Her protocols, which had been developed over years of experience with mass casualty events, were quickly implemented throughout the emergency department. The result was immediate improvement in patient flow and treatment efficiency. Dr. Blackwood watched from the administrative corridor as Sarah worked tirelessly through the night. He saw her emerge from successful surgeries only to immediately evaluate the next critical case. He watched her encourage exhausted staff members and provide guidance to younger doctors who were struggling with unfamiliar procedures. By dawn, the crisis had been brought under control. All critical patients had been stabilized, and the hospital had successfully managed the largest mass casualty event in its history. The families who had spent the night in agonizing uncertainty were now receiving positive updates about their loved ones' conditions. Sarah finally allowed herself a brief break as the last ambulance departed and the emergency department returned to normal operations. She stood in the break room, drinking coffee and reviewing patient charts to ensure no details had been overlooked. That's where Dr. Blackwood found her. "Sarah," he began, then stopped. After watching her work through the night, he understood how catastrophic his mistake had been. This wasn't just about losing a talented surgeon. He had nearly destroyed the hospital's ability to fulfill its most fundamental mission. "The patients are stable," Sarah said without looking up from the charts. "Dr. Walsh and her team handled the ongoing cases very well once we got the protocols in place. You have good people here, Richard. You just need to trust them to do their jobs." "About yesterday," Blackwood started, but Sarah held up a hand. "Yesterday doesn't matter right now. What matters is that we saved lives that might have been lost. What matters is that your hospital proved it could handle a crisis when it really counted." She finally looked at him directly. "But what matters most is what you do going forward." Blackwood nodded slowly. "I want you to come back, Sarah, not just for emergencies like this, but permanently. We need you here." Sarah considered his words carefully. "If I come back, things need to change. I need support for innovative approaches when conventional methods aren't sufficient. I need administration that understands that saving lives sometimes requires taking calculated risks. And I need assurance that patient care will always take priority over administrative convenience." "You have it," Blackwood said without hesitation. "All of it. I should have recognized what you brought to this hospital before it was almost too late." As Sarah gathered her things to leave, she paused at the window overlooking the emergency department parking lot. The news vans were gone, the families had returned home with their loved ones, and normal morning traffic was beginning to flow around the hospital. The crisis was over, but its lessons would remain. The Navy helicopter that had brought her was preparing for departure from the roof, its mission completed. Sarah had been given the option to return to Norfolk with the aircraft or make her own way home. She chose to stay, taking it as a sign that her place was here. At St. Mary's Medical Center, where unconventional methods and unwavering dedication could mean the difference between life and death. Dr. Jennifer Walsh found her mentor in the parking lot an hour later, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Are you really coming back?" she asked. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since her termination. "It looks that way, but things are going to be different this time. We're going to build an emergency department that's truly prepared for anything, and we're going to train every staff member to think beyond conventional limitations." As she drove away from the hospital that morning, Sarah reflected on the events of the past day. She had been cast aside for being too dedicated to patient care, only to be desperately needed when that dedication became the difference between life and death. The Navy helicopter had delivered more than just a surgeon to St. Mary's Medical Center. It had delivered a lesson about the true meaning of medical leadership. Dr. Blackwood watched from his office window as Sarah's car disappeared into the morning traffic. He had learned that effective hospital administration wasn't about rigid protocols and cost containment. It was about enabling exceptional medical professionals to do their best work. Sometimes the most unconventional approaches produced the most extraordinary results, and the measure of a leader was knowing when to step back and let excellence flourish. The crisis had ended, but its impact would shape St. Mary's Medical Center for years to come. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of helicopter rotors faded into the morning sky, carrying with it the memory of a night when the right person arrived at exactly the right moment to make all the difference.